Hello, guys. Welcome to another special Mouth of the Tyne live with show tonight. We've got well-respected journalist Ben Jacobs with us tonight. Ben, thank you so much for being here, my friend. Thank you very much.
Of course. How are you, Ben?
Yeah, I'm fine, mate. Really good. I'm better than this time last year, anyway. That's for sure. Yeah. Well, want to start with we'll start with the takeover, because that's a point where I think you came to prominence with a lot of, I won't say football fans, because you were very well known in the field already, but especially with Newcastle United fans. Your name was at the forefront of the takeover saga. That's where I first came into contact with yourself, and you were very straight down the line. Now, sometimes that, Newcastle United fans were very eager for this takeover. So maybe when you told us the truth all the time, maybe we weren't always 100% happy with that. But we did get there in the end. And throughout the whole saga, you told it as it was. You were neither for nor against, although sometimes I think Newcastle fans used to get so frustrated and think maybe you were on one side of the fence. But I think when the dust settled and the panic had, relaxed, I think people did, well, I know certainly I did, realize that you just reported it as it was. You didn't dress it up. So, yeah, I'd just like to get your thoughts on the takeover, really. And we're almost a year on from it, October the 7th. We've got about 3 weeks to go until there's a anniversary, so to speak. So, yeah, I mean, we've come a long way in a year, but how do you feel about the takeover itself? Did you think we would ever get to that point on a personal level? Did you feel that we would get there?
Well, I think there's two different points here. One is the saga itself, and the other is the aftermath. And of course, Newcastle fans will be delighted with the latter because they've got their club back, and it's about that affinity between owners that are hands-on. And certainly in the case of Amanda Staveley and the Rubins, are very proactive and visible at games. But I think it's more than that as well. It's the culture that Eddie Howe's building, and Dan Ashworth as well. The little touches go a long way with this fan base because they were so kind of beaten down with their morale and their ambition under Mike Ashley that the investment and the long-term strategy is part of the dream. But right now, there's just the reality, I think, of a football club that has much more of a connection between players and fans, between owners and fans, and therefore between football club and city. And anyone that's been to Newcastle won't be lost on the fact that you go up to the top where Newcastle Castle is and where the stadium is, and then you're looking down on the whole city. And that's a very fitting visual backdrop for what the football club really means to Newcastle. And when the fans, therefore, feel a disconnect, don't really want to attend games, don't believe that the club is going anywhere, I think more so than most major cities that have football clubs, it bleeds into the very culture and day to day of how a lot of football fans live. And that's why the takeover has been so important. And then, of course, you have the saga itself. And naturally, and you find this particularly on social media, any fan that wants a takeover is going to be relatively blind in how they see the situation because it's all about just getting the takeover done. But I said many times during the 18 months or so, if it was that simple, if it was that clear cut, then it wouldn't have taken 18 months. And ultimately, like or loathe the Premier League and similarly feel like it was Qatar influenced or not, the entire situation was intertwined with a variety of different plots that were complicated. And it's absolutely no surprise that when the geopolitics alleviated and Qatar and Saudi Arabia had a better relationship, and then the piracy situation was resolved concerning beIN Sports, the takeover was completed very quickly because ultimately the Premier League had a vantage point that they felt PIF were controlled and directly influenced by the Saudi government. And PIF said there are layers of separation, so Newcastle United is not at risk of being influenced by the Saudi government. And the Premier League stuck to their guns because fundamentally they wanted to, one, make sure that due diligence was done, and two, also be clear with PIF that Saudi Arabia had ripped off Premier League rights, and they ultimately didn't want to sanction a sale from a majority owner that had links to the Saudi Arabian government, because they believed that that same government actually stole their rights. And you can understand why that whole subplot slowed things down. And I think that whether you side with the cover-up, the Big Six conspiracy, or any other theory, what we're all looking for is transparency. And that extends to Newcastle's ownership group and, of course, the Premier League. And ultimately, it would be reassuring in the long run, and with the views of future clubs and tests, for the Premier League to be open about exactly what happened and why there was such a dramatic U-turn. And if, as I've reported, and I believe this to be the case, it was piracy catalyzed, which sped up the entire takeover. And similarly, Newcastle United's owners also need to, I think, be more transparent directly with the fan base, and from a selfish point of view with the media as well. And what we're seeing is a lot of good things from Eddie Howe and Amanda and also the Rubens, and that's building a community-focused club again with all the things I've already said. And it's translating on the football field to momentum that's started last season. And if it continues until May, Newcastle will have a very good season. And then there's PIF. And I think what's interesting is that PIF were part of this drive in their statements and in their briefings throughout the 18 months about transparency, about having nothing to hide, about being open, about feeling like they were hard done by. And Mike Ashley was obviously on their side as well, shouting and screaming to try and get everything done. And now they're in. We haven't heard from Yasser Al-Rumayyan. He hasn't engaged with fan bases. He hasn't engaged with the media. And I hold my hands up and say that Newcastle United shouldn't be the anomaly, the exception, but every ownership group has a different complexion and a series of different things that are required of them, both by their fan base and the wider media. And because of Newcastle's complex takeover and where the club is heading, there will be more scrutiny on Newcastle, as there will for Manchester City, as there should have been for Roman Abramovich as well. And I think the thing that I always was a little bit surprised by during the entire 18 months was that when fans fell out with me, the counter argument tended to not be about what Newcastle or their ownership group could do right, but it was more focused around what other clubs were doing wrong. And I've said it many times that if football is to improve and be more transparent and potentially be independently regulated, and if everyone in the long run is to work within a fair set of consistent rules, which I think is what we all want ultimately. And even Newcastle fans would say they don't love the idea of a big six. If Newcastle become a big seven, I think there'll be a fair few fans that would rather have a parity between all 20 clubs rather than just enter into the politics and the dynamic of the big six. Just because you've got an invite, it doesn't mean that everyone wants to accept it. And I think that whenever people made a counterpoint to me, it was always, well, why us? What about X? Manchester City or Chelsea and so on. And two wrongs don't make a right. So just because Manchester City have found a loophole in the past, just because other clubs are working around financial fair play, just because other clubs have had owners that are dubious and should have been more scrutinized, such as Burnley. Look at Thaksin Shinawatra when he was at Manchester City as well. That doesn't mean that a new ownership group should be able to just point to those examples and walk through the door. It should be the opposite. There should be a learning from each takeover. So actually, with every new ownership group, the bar gets higher and higher and the test gets more and more consistent. And I think that's what we're all striving for. And if Newcastle's majority owner and the Premier League, even in the aftermath, are not transparent and open about what happened, what the learnings are, how the test is going to change, if they don't take on board the fan-led review recommendations and so on, then we're going to end up cyclical. And some clubs will be happy because they've got what they want. And then another club will come along with another new owner and there'll be another new problem. And we'll keep going round and round in these murky waters without ever getting the transparency. So I think in the aftermath now, I say what I've always said, which is Newcastle's a great club. It's brilliant to see what they're doing on the field. And off the field, Newcastle, Premier League, and many other clubs still need that transparency and independent regulation, so we don't get in these 18-month sagas over and over again.
Yeah, great points there. I agree with a lot of what you said there, Ben. Just something I want to touch on. I think the frustration around the Newcastle United fans around the time of the takeover, I believe that was amplified due to the situation of who were our current owners at the time, that being Mike Ashley. I think if we'd had decent owners that were willing to spend, as far as I'm aware, he still left the club with a zero net spend after 14 years. If we had decent owners that were willing to just put in a little bit of money, just a little hint of ambition, I think the Newcastle United fan base in general would have been so much more calmer and more relaxed whilst this takeover was unfolding. It's like, yes, we desperately wanted it, but we would have been happy to wait until things were done officially and appropriately if we'd had decent owners. But I think the fact that our owner at the time was just so tyrannical that we just wanted him out so badly that it often clouded our judgment as to how quick we wanted this pushed through. And like you said there, it needed to be right. It needed to be legit. It couldn't just be pushed through and slapdash. But we would have been so much more patient if we'd had decent owners running the show whilst this was going on. I truly believe that was part of the issue, and it spilled over into social media, with journalists like yourself and Luke Edwards and another journalists that weren't always 100% giving us positive news. Not that you could help that, but I think it often spilled over into things like that. Because of the mass frustration of 14 years of misery. So, I just wanted to add that to what you were saying. There's a little footnote. So, we got there in the end, that's for sure. On the takeover, has it met your expectations? Obviously not as a Newcastle United fan, because obviously you aren't. You're a Leicester lad, I believe. But has it met your expectations as as a journalist, what you thought would happen? Have you seen so far with regards to the staffing improvements and the hierarchy we've kind of developed with Darren Eales coming in and other figureheads, and the transfer window too? Has this tallied with what you thought would happen? Has it been on par, or is it kind of slightly under par, or how do you feel on that?
I think it's been brilliant on the football side for sure. And as far as the business and the commercial deals, they will, I think, still escalate, especially now we're moving out of the COVID-19 pandemic, at least as far as sport is concerned, and the market will pick up. And I fully expect Newcastle over the course of the coming season or two to bring on board a variety of either international or MENA, Middle East and North Africa focused partners. And of course, Saudi Arabia will be the main focus, not just because of the majority owner, but in that Middle East and North Africa region, Saudi Arabia is the biggest market. And that is why beIN Sports were so intent upon fighting the piracy, because they'd lost about 33% of their business because everything in that region comes from Saudi Arabia. And obviously we've seen one or two deals like Noor, which is the sort of equivalent of Amazon out there, that can now sell Newcastle United shirts. So slowly deals are getting done. But what's impressed me the most is that Newcastle have walked before they have tried to run. And that has been evident in their spending and the manner in which they've negotiated over certain deals. They were not prepared to be bullied by the selling clubs or agents. Hugo Ekitike, the failed deal, is one good example of that. And then with Eddie Howe and Dan Ashworth, in fact, too, you have very humble, grounded, methodical persons that are not going to be swayed almost by the long-term ambition and spending power of the club. I think you could have a certain kind of coach come in with the volume of money available to Newcastle United and their level of ambition, and they could want to spend, and perhaps they could get a bit greedy in the short term about where they expect the club to be. And that in turn can create squads that are too big, wage bills that are too high, and so on. But I think that Eddie Howe has come in and really just tried to create that chemistry. And when you stay up in the manner that Newcastle did, not in last day drama, but with an emphatic win streak. So although you've actually survived, and there was a point mid-season where that looked very unlikely, the way in which Newcastle have been able to do it on the field has built this momentum. So they've ultimately ended last season feeling like they're in a position of European form. And that's the best possible thing, because you get the spike and the momentum and the joy of actually staying up, plus the added sort of push from actually turning things around so quickly, plus the freshness of the new signings, plus the fact that you're actually winning games and ultimately competing with really top sides. And we've seen that even in the loss to Liverpool this season, and of course with that thrilling draw to Manchester City as well. So on the football side, I think it's exactly what I expected, because the new ownership group had always briefed pretty staunchly that they were not just going to dig deep into their pockets and throw money carelessly, foolishly, quickly at things. They were going to buy for the moment based upon a 3 to 5 year plan. So then after having a decent January and finding a core kind of spine and adding a bit of depth, then it was no surprise to me that in the summer window, Newcastle were not chucking around money on all of these so-called marquee signings that were being very loosely linked. And I think that that's very wise, because if they'd have randomly gone for Neymar or Gareth Bale, it wouldn't have really worked. And the reason for that is not only because the player may not be willing to come to Newcastle at this point due to the lack of, say, Champions League or certainly European football. The other thing is that when you're in Newcastle's position now, you have to pay more for the same player. And I think that's what fans don't always get. That, let's say hypothetically you want Neymar. If you've got that Champions League football, if you're competing for the Premier League, then you can offer him a package within your wage structure. Whereas to persuade the same Neymar to come now, you have to pay above the odds, including sky-high wages. And then everyone else at the football club, if you reach Champions League, aspires somewhere close to that number. Not exactly the same number, but what you're doing is you're setting a bar too high too early for an individual player. And then your whole wage structure gets rocked as a result of it. So you have to be very careful of that when you're looking for a marquee.
Has to be gradual. Yeah.
So they've done that very well. They've created, as I've already said, this spirit, this chemistry with the fan base. I like the regular team photos from the dressing room. I like seeing things from behind the scenes, which as a fan you wouldn't normally see. And they use social media and their website very well for that. And then I think away from the football, the area of improvement is again around working out what the long-term connection is with Saudi Arabia and PIF and Newcastle United, and how exactly it fits into Vision 2030. And I think that I would have expected perhaps more of a strategy outlined, even if only through official club channels, so we knew exactly what to expect. Because Newcastle have been over to Saudi Arabia now. We know that they're considering soccer schools out there. We know they're considering twinning with Saudi Arabian clubs to kind of share resources and so on. And we know that there will be a scouting network out there. But what's the long-term impact? How does it fit into Vision 2030? Because Vision 2030 is all about creating jobs. It's all about improving lifestyle. It's all about raising the bar in terms of your quality of life and also the economy without being over-reliant on the oil and the gas industry. And at the same time, Saudi Arabia wants to use sport alongside other properties to drive tourism, particularly in newer areas. They have one called a Red Sea development and another kind of super city called Neom, which is perhaps going to be the most westernized part of Saudi Arabia. And they've already hosted things like beach soccer over there. I went over for that. And of course, they've got other sports events that play into that portfolio, like the new golf tour, like the Formula One, like the boxing, and so on. So how does Newcastle fit into all of that? And is there, as I've always been told, a kind of inverse of that model where instead of just allowing Newcastle and the football club to benefit Saudi Arabia, how can tenets of Vision 2030 around improving the community be brought into Newcastle? How can the football club create more jobs in Newcastle? How can things around the football club be developed and expanded, create a better lifestyle, and even further integrate the club, even though it already is well integrated into the community? And like taking on the women's team formally and officially is one good example of that. And then I think all of that then helps you get better fan engagement, which will be one of Darren Eales' main priorities. So all of this is developing, but we don't really know what PIF's direct game plan is around taking the football club into Saudi Arabia, aside from a few commercial clues like the Noor deal. And then I think the other thing is that we don't know what PIF's wider plan is. We constantly hear rumoured with buyout of Inter, very loosely, some interest in Marseille, and it tends to get shot down. But are they the kind of group that are going to use Newcastle and other feeder clubs? Are they going to invest a minority stake in another big club within the Champions League, or are they happy with just one? And I think these are questions we're entitled to ask as journalists, and as yet PIF haven't answered it. So I think they get a 10 out of 10 on the football side. I think that Staveley and the Rubin brothers get a 9 out of 10. And I think that PIF at the moment, more like a 5 out of 10. And the 5 is a 5 out of 5 if we're scoring it on their passion and investment and turnaround, and no doubt what they're doing internally. And then the 0 out of 5 is around that future strategy and transparency that they spoke of so often in the takeover, but have yet to actually sit in front of either the fan base or the journalists to explain what they plan to do between, let's say now, 2022 and 2030, when Vision 2030 arrives.
Yeah, it's been very noticeable. Certainly, I can't speak on other fans' behalf, but on my behalf, the lack of communication from PIF, considering they are the 80% shareholders. You know, we've got the face of the club with Amanda and Murdad, and Jamie Rubin, who've done a fantastic job. You know, I love those guys to bits for what they've done. But in general, as a kind of, you know, on the corporate side with PIF, you know, the big conglomerate, if you will, it's they've been very much completely silent. And it is a funny situation because, as you say, you know, everyone's kind of expecting and waiting for them to say something or outline a plan on their behalf. And like, if they were the minority shareholders, they could probably get away with staying silent. But when you're the 80% shareholders, people will always look to, you know, the majority shareholders and say, like, you know, so what's the you know, what outline the ambition, or, you know, what's happening here? Because I found it quite strange that the majority shareholders haven't issued more statements, you know, whether it was through Yasir or, you know, just a general statement for themselves as a corporation. I'm hoping that will change in the future. You know, I would like to hear more from the majority shareholders of my football club. I don't think we should just put it down to a couple of figureheads who, like I say, although they've done an excellent job, shouldn't just, you know, put the pressure all on their shoulders. I think PIF could take a lot of the weight and the strain off by just releasing periodic statements, you know, outlining ambition and such like that. So yeah, very good point there. I think that's something that we should definitely hope that they do improve in the future. So I just want to touch on the transfer window. Obviously, we've already touched on it briefly. In future transfer windows, when we maybe have bigger sponsors, which is something what we're looking for next summer, really thinking that there's going to be one, possibly two ginormous sponsor deals next summer. Do you think this will change the strategy, you know, how it ties in with incoming, you know, profits and FFP and such? Do you think it might change the strategy, or do you think they would just keep it the same and keep ticking over, adding a couple of key players here and there, on a couple of squad players and just build it up slowly? Or do you think that the ability to spend more money, they might just go for it? What's your thoughts on that, Ben?
Well, I think even before any big commercial deals incoming, Newcastle have got enough leeway if they wanted to spend, but it's about planning for the long term and also being respectful of what's already been built. And if you look at Newcastle now, they've got a fair amount of depth, particularly at the back and in that midfield area. They've got some players that were on the peripherals last season that have got a bit of a second wind and have started the season well. Miguel Almiron is one example of that. And they brought a striker at the end of the last window in Isak. And then with Callum Wilson and Chris Wood and a variety of others behind that can chip in with a few goals like ASM and Bruno, there's a lot to like about Newcastle. There's already a big competition for the centre-back positions. I think that Trippier, Joe Linton, Bruno, Wilson, when he's fit, they're not really going to be ousted from the team. So if you're looking to spend now, what is the purpose? And if, for example, Newcastle get to January and they've either got a few injuries or they find themselves in and around the top six, then that might make the difference. And at that point, they may dip into their pockets. And because they've kind of had an inverse of most clubs in how they've approached the last two windows, January might be a big window again. And they may look to get themselves over the line to get European football a little bit earlier than perhaps the plan is. And I think that's what's really interesting about the short term for Newcastle, that from a budgetary point of view, even though clubs will never put this out there, they'll be aiming to finish 10th. It's what most clubs do. And then that is your bottom line for what you're planning for. And if they finish any higher, you get more prize money. And then if you finish significantly higher, you find yourself in European football. And at that point, a lot of your bottom lines can change. And then you will spend more in the market. But if you move too fast too soon, even though that success is going to be warmly received by the fan base, you can also be forced to spend. And I think that Newcastle naturally want to get success in European football as soon as they can. But what they don't want to do is kind of be a one-season wonder and then find that they're stuck with high wage bills and signings that they don't really see as a fit anymore, or become unsettled because they joined for European football and then the following season there is no European football. So I think if you said to Eddie Howe right now, would you rather finish 10th, 9th, 8th, 7th, 6th, 5th, 4th in the next 7 years? And then once you get to 4th, you'll be 4th, 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 and then you'll be a regular in the Champions League. I think he'd bite your hand off it. Whereas if you said to Eddie Howe, you'll be 6th this season, and then who knows? At that point, it becomes harder because you get that instant success and your wage bill goes sky high and your rewards go sky high and you have to pay out on almost everything. And I've seen this firsthand with my club, Leicester, where we win the Premier League unexpectedly. We have a few good seasons. And every single one of those seasons, the knock-on effect is that you have to give players rewards, because when Leicester win the Premier League, they get an insane bonus. All the wages go up. Everyone gets a new deal. When Leicester get to the quarterfinals of the Champions League, the same thing happens. When Leicester, not last season, but in the previous 2 seasons, missed out on Champions League football on the final day, they still get huge bonuses because Champions League football was never even their aim. Even last season, when Leicester finished 8th in the Premier League, they get big bonuses because Leicester's aim will have been 10th or better, and you cannot not pay out. So then you get yourself in a situation where if you have Europe immediately and almost in an unplanned way, you have to be quite reactive, not proactive, because you know you need the depth and a caliber of players becomes available. And of course, you snap them up. And then at the same time, you pay your whole squad a very high spike of incentive-driven bonuses. And before you know it, you've got a big squad on high wages and you've got to back that up. And if you don't get the balance right and the chemistry right and you spend for the sake of it, you can find quite an unsettled dressing room all on big money. And from there, it can be a long way back. Whereas if you show faith in your core squad that are already on sensible wages and happy at the football club and know that the aim is mid-table or better, then you build and you reward and you foster a loyalty, and that all creates momentum. And I think that clubs like Newcastle that realise that don't look at last season and say, well, they were the ones that got us out of trouble, but they're not going to be good enough for European football. They actually say they were the ones that were short of confidence and beaten down to the ground and not playing well under Bruce's system, but really on paper with a fair amount of talent. And with a few additions and a few tweaks and a fresh manager and more attack-minded play, they're all now easily good enough to finish mid-table or better. So then you stick with the core. So then I don't really see Newcastle needing to spend a great deal in January, because their strategy in this window was to find a young striker that could be, for now, a backup or a different kind of option to Callum Wilson, but in the long term, a replacement. And then Chris Wood is still there. And then they wanted Sven Botman, and they got Sven Botman, which they started in January. And then the only thing they really missed out on was more of a creative-minded player that falls into the mould, if you like, of one or two that Newcastle have been linked with, like a Jack Harrison, like a James Maddison, like a Rafinha, like a Christian Pulisic or a Callum Hudson-Odoi. Someone effectively that can either play centrally or out wide, that can be versatile, that can switch sides, that is a high source of assists and can chip in potentially with 5 or 10 goals a season as well, depending on how much freedom they're given to get into the box. And I think that will be the top priority. And then they've already brought in another backup goalkeeper now. So there's not too much more that they need to do. So it wouldn't surprise me if things are going well, if Newcastle look to make one marquee signing to reinforce their attacking options and make sure that if Wilson gets injured or Isak doesn't take to the Premier League too quickly, then at that point, they've got enough to continue momentum. But this, for me, is the key word for Newcastle. It's about continuing that feel-good factor off the field and the form on the field, and showing that in every single game, win, lose or draw, they can compete. And if that gets them to 10th or 9th or 8th, then I think they'll see that as a fantastic step forwards, even if the fan base see it as a little bit underwhelming. And then from there, it's actually, for me, going to be a year from now, not the January window, but a year from now. If Newcastle's foundation coming into next season is 8th place, let's say, and anything else is a bonus, then from there, I think it's the following season that we'll see them spend a bit heavier. And at that point, they'll start to become a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah, I think so too. I think January will be relatively quiet. Maybe another bid for Maddison. I don't like to do this to you because you obviously would love to keep Maddison, but do you think there's a chance that we could maybe steal him in January? Or is that something that, you think the clubs would maybe look to address in the summer? Because obviously his contract's got 2 years remaining, but price-wise, they're probably not going to get much more than what they could have had this summer, possibly. So it could be, anything, if there's a sale, anything from here on in could be less than the 50 million that was touted. What's your thoughts on Maddison, Ben?
I think Maddison's tough for Newcastle, and even though they made a couple of bids, they were significantly below Leicester's valuation. And ultimately, Leicester want Maddison to sign a new deal. They're not in the best position to pitch to Maddison, but I think the volume of interest in Maddison, especially if the price drops even by 5 or 10 million, will mean that there are suitors chasing after him who can offer him European football. Yes. And Tottenham were looking at both Zaniolo and Maddison as two possible options. They didn't move on either, and he's going to be in demand. And therefore, for Newcastle to get Maddison, they're going to have to be in a very strong position in the race for European football in January, I think, to stand a realistic chance. And I think that's the kind of key point in all of this, that he is a very ambitious player. He's not afraid to back his own ability and be patient. So we don't really have a Wesley Fofana situation, as was proven when Newcastle were bidding for Maddison, where the player's head is distracted. The two that Brendan Rodgers felt were looking for moves away were Fofana, who went to Chelsea, and Yuri Tielemans, who is still at the football club. Maddison just got on with business as usual. And I think that will be exactly the same in January as well. So I wouldn't be remotely surprised now if he either signs a new deal at Leicester, and a new deal doesn't mean he's staying. A new deal ultimately just means that it protects the sell-on value, but that makes it, again, much harder for Newcastle comparative to hoping that Maddison wanted the move and won't sign a new deal, and then allows Newcastle to enter the market in the January window at a lower rate. But I think more likely with Maddison, from what I understand, is he'll sign a new deal at Leicester with a gentleman's agreement or possibly a formal clause that still allows him to leave in 2023. And then in a year's time, next summer, let's see who comes in for him in the market. But it wouldn't remotely surprise me if in that year's time, if Newcastle don't have European football, if they become up against a rival who does have European football. And then at that point, I think that Maddison is eyeing London. He's eyeing European football. Spurs for him would be the perfect kind of club. The challenge for him is that Spurs have shown interest and nothing more, whereas Newcastle have actually made a bid. But I think he backs himself enough to not make a rushed decision, and therefore if he senses through his team and his form, and he was Leicester's player of the season last season, so if that continues, there's no reason why he won't have the form. If he senses that a European football club is coming, whether that's in January or the summer, then I think that he'll just keep Newcastle hanging should they not have European football likely, and hold out for that sort of Wesley Fofana to Chelsea style move. And it wouldn't even surprise me if Chelsea become interested in the player as well, depending on how Graham Potter fares. So I think it's unlikely at the moment that there will be a Maddison to Newcastle move. But what we know is Howe really liked the player. At one point during the window, he was a big priority. So let's see what happens in January.
Yeah, and he's a prime age as well, isn't he? 25, I think he's 25, maybe 26 now, something like that, isn't he? So he's kind of like, he's in that key age range for his, he's the prime of his career. And I think he probably will move, like you say, between now and 2023. But someone that kind of ties in a little bit, who I thought maybe would have moved to a bigger club sooner, is James Ward-Prowse. I didn't actually realize that Ward-Prowse, I think he's actually 29 now, which probably will shock a lot of people. I know it shocked me when I read it. I thought, because in your head, you still think of Ward-Prowse as being like this. Yeah, you don't realize he's got 10 Premier League seasons under his belt. I know I didn't. So I think Maddison will probably look to avoid something like that. But you never know. If Leicester, if they're on the up again in a couple of years' time, then he might stay there. Football's a crazy business. You just don't know what's going to happen, do you? But yeah, so we'll see. We'll see what the Maddison situation is in January and maybe next summer. Right, let's move on. You came to visit us, Ben, in April. I've got a photo here. If you allow me to pop this up just for a second. Where we are? There we are. Can you see that?
I can see that.
Yeah. Looking great there. I must say black and white does suit you. Yeah, there's another one here. Not sure if this lady friend is your partner or just a friend or yeah, very nice. Yeah. Well, I hope you had a lovely time when you came up. What was the atmosphere like? Did you enjoy yourself? Obviously, that was a trip of you weren't at work, I guess. I'm sure you visit the club and the stadium when you are at work, on and off. But this was a trip of leisure.
Yeah, it was. And it was a trip to see Leicester concede a last-minute winner from Bruno.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Was it that one? I couldn't remember what game it was. Right. So that ties in. Right. It makes perfect sense. Leicester. Yeah, of course. Right.
So it was great. I mean, I always enjoy a visit to St. James's Park as an away fan, as a kid coming up as well. I think I used to quite like the fact, as many away fans do, that you're right up in the heavens. And it's just one of those iconic stadiums. And I think there were a few things that were clear from coming up. The first was that the atmosphere was electric, and it reminded me of the same type of vibe as during the Kevin Keegan era. And I think people forget how flat, how silent, how empty in parts St. James's Park became under Mike Ashley, certainly from a non-Newcastle perspective. And then teams, I think, that have perhaps been there in the last 4 or 5 years can be quite taken aback at the difference in volume and noise and atmosphere.
I agree. Yeah.
When St James's Park is roaring, it helps the team start the game and finish the game stronger, and it sets the tone. And Kevin Keegan always used to say that your first task is not opposition related. It's about winning over the fan base and the crowd in the first 5 or 10 minutes of each half. And you definitely see that with Newcastle now, the manner in which they start, the energy, the passion. Whereas I think under Steve Bruce at home, they were a little bit in their shell. They were short of confidence. They were not passing it around as progressive. They were not trying to score early. They didn't get that many first half goals, period. So that's the big change, to have a game like the other week against Manchester City and keep getting ahead in the game and keep being on the front foot against a strong team that are expected to dominate the game and keep hold of the ball. That's the change. And I think the fan base have got a big part to play in that. And then the Leicester game specifically, it was kind of a win, even though it was pretty obvious that Newcastle were going to be safe. It was kind of a win that I think all but mathematically put them safe. I don't think it did secure safety, but I think it put Newcastle to a point where they were basically safe. And that was why there was so much jubilance. And the fact
it was special. It was a special ending to the game. Yeah, it was.
And the fact that it was Bruno that scored the last-minute winner, I think, summed up his contribution and his kind of cult status at the club. And when he joined, I think I certainly felt he'd take a little bit longer to not necessarily settle, but certainly find that consistency. And, he's not really a known consistent goal scorer, not to the point of kind of 10 or 12 goals a season. No, but he ended that season just seemingly chipping in every other game in some capacity. And I think that just added to the reputation and the love. And it's great when you see a player that relaxed and relishing the occasion. But I think the thing that struck me was not really inside the stadium. I think the thing that really stood out to me was more around after the match and watching the importance of the win again to the city. And obviously after every win, a fan base leaves and celebrates in the pubs and the clubs and the bars and so on. And then usually everybody goes to bed or goes home at some point, and then they turn their attention to work. And sure, they're talking about football, but the terrace songs, the shirts being worn, they don't quite bleed over for as long. And what I kind of noticed in that aftermath, because we stayed over, is that we were at a relatively fancy bar in the centre of town called The Botanist, which is not really a football bar. No. And people were still sort of singing the Bruno song. They were still celebrating there very spontaneously. And then even the next morning on the street, you would see people, whether in suits or whether in Newcastle shirts, someone would set someone else off because they'd perhaps see a scarf or they'd see a shirt. And the celebrations just lingered and became part of that kind of daily tone and narrative within the city. And, it was a significant win, but for a bog standard league win still, when the team is basically safe against a side like Leicester, for that to kind of continue into the everyday, into the fancy restaurants, into the newsagents the next day, into the traffic if someone sees a Newcastle bumper sticker, into the train station on the way home, 24, 48 hours afterwards. That was the thing that really struck me, because you don't get that in Leicester, even after really big things, like winning the Premier League's an exception. But, even after we beat Sevilla in the Champions League round of 16, you get it within 12 hours, you get it within the bars. But once everyone sobers up, once everyone has a shower, gets ready for work the next day, it's gone. And I think that was the big thing for me, that connection, that appreciation, that language of football, whether singing or spoken, or even just gestured, even just a nod here or a smile there.
Yeah, and I totally get you. Yeah.
It comes from not just those inside St James's Park. It comes from the person running a shop around the corner. It comes from the taxi driver that wasn't at the game. It comes from the non-Newcastle fan that lives in Newcastle. It just gives that city a buzz that lasts for a lot longer than in other cities I've seen. And I think that was the big thing that struck me.
Yeah, I had Al Walid, the Saudi Newcastle United fan. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him from Twitter. He's quite popular amongst our fan base. Had him on the show the other night, and I said something very similar. That obviously he hasn't been over to a lot of games, so I was trying to tell him how the atmosphere had obviously improved since October the 7th, and pretty much everything what you just said there, I'd said the other night on the show. And it's great that an outsider like yourself has noticed these things too, because it's completely changed since the takeover. It's like there's much more camaraderie. Often you would go to the game and you might be stood next to someone that you didn't know, and you might chat or you might not. Now it's almost written that you will definitely end up getting a hug off that person next to you, and just stuff like that, and chatting to random people that you've never spoken to before. That element is definitely, I've noticed on a personal level. Sometimes if my friends are working, I often go through by myself. Can't always go with a friend these days, especially with tickets being in high demand. So you often meet people in the bars, in the stadium, and you're chatting away and you're having a great time. And this might be normal, even just on a match day, that might be normal at other clubs. But what we were missing for so long in this 14 years of dark ages under Ashley was this, this atmosphere. It was a myth. It was like, this famous atmosphere of Newcastle United. Yeah, it was such in the 90s and even the early 90s. But by the time Ashley's rule had taken hold, it was nothing more than a myth. All these years, 14 years, we've persevered in going, but have we really been enjoying it? Has our hearts truly been in it? I know mine hasn't all the time. It's been more of a ritual, a routine than a fun hobby. I wouldn't have called it a fun hobby. What I was, I live in Durham, so I get the train through from Durham, and the train back was always horrendous, especially after defeat. It was such a long trip. It was only a 10-minute ride, but feels like you're on that train a lifetime. But that's all gone now. The people are looking forward to traveling there and traveling back. My parents have actually started staying over in the city, getting a hotel for the night and making a whole, night of it. And they only live local. So it's like, you can see where I'm going with that. Like the whole atmosphere is just, the ante is just upped massively. But it really means a lot to us that, people like yourself have noticed that too. It's just so nice to hear that someone from outside the area has seen this with their own eyes. So I'm glad you had a good time, my friend. Yeah. So we're just going to wind it down now. I want to get your thoughts on this before we go. We touched on it briefly, but I didn't think it'd be right to have you on not ask you about Leicester. Obviously, I know you're a Leicester fan. We've touched on the Maddison deal and such like that, but I just want your thoughts on where you think things have, I don't want to say gone wrong at Leicester, but maybe it's not quite gone right over the past couple of seasons, because you guys have really set the standard of, the best of the rest. Obviously, you had that amazing season that you won the Premier League, which I don't think will be repeated for a long time from a club of that kind of at that level at that time. But and you've obviously still won. Was it the FA Cup too? You won, didn't you? Yeah. So you've had some good victories with regards to silverware, but it just seems like the last couple of years, especially, it's tailing off. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. I had a theory that it's a sensitive subject, but did it have something to do with possibly the incident with the owner and the family taking over when they have different ideas, or that's just as an outsider. You as the insider will probably know a lot more than me. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that before we said goodbye.
Yeah, I don't think it's got anything to do with the late owner Kung Vishai, who obviously tragically lost his life after a game against West Ham in that helicopter crash. His son Top has taken over as chairman. There's continuity. It's the same ownership group. It's the same CEO in Susan Whelan. And everything about the club continues to be ambitious, but also sustainable. The problem at Leicester is a mixture of things, really. First of all, their success, as I said before, has resulted in having to pay out higher wages and bonuses. And each time they've done top things, they've had to be rewarded, which means suddenly you've got a very high wage bill at the club. and it can be harder to offload players. And I think even though there was a great respect and love for, say, Kasper Schmeichel, getting him off to Nice was very important because he's one that's just seen his wage go up and up and up and up. Jamie Vardy, though, has just signed a new deal. They obviously renewed Fofana before he left for Chelsea, and they want Maddison to sign a new deal as well. The same for Harvey Barnes. And there's a few other younger players at the football club that they have to pay the going rate. And what you find when a young talent comes through, if you've paid these high wages that I spoke about before, is you have a big gulf between the lower earners and the highest earners, which means then when a young player you want to keep breaks onto the scene and proves themselves to be of Premier League quality, when they negotiate for improved terms, they, perhaps not quite what Vardy gets, but they want a top wage. They want to be one of the best earners. It's the same with, say, Reece James at Chelsea. He was on relatively modest wages. Chelsea wanted to keep him. Now they have to make him the highest paid defender at the football club. And Leicester can't keep affording to do that. So they're victims, financially speaking, of their own success in many ways. That's the first thing. And obviously, had they qualified for the Champions League the season before last or 2 seasons before last, things might have been a little bit different because they'd have had a bit more of a windfall. So the volume of spending required as Leicester compared to one of the big 6 to play in Europe and to challenge for Europe has required Leicester to spend above their means. And as a consequence, this summer, they've had to sell before they can buy. So that's number one. And then number 2 is that wage bill that I've already mentioned. And number 3 is the fact that, which in the long term is going to be a really good thing, they've spent a massive amount of money on a world-class training facility, and it will pay off at some point.
It is spectacular, that, I must say. Yeah, I would love something like that for ourselves. We're not quite there yet with our training ground, but at least said the better on that. Sorry, go on.
But, you know, these things require a massive amount of investment. So then you're restricted in the market as to what you can do. And I think that they've looked at the books and they've determined that this is the window when Leicester need to sell first and then buy second. And I think the club's decision was, rather than needing to buy, they would prefer to try and hang on to their prized assets. And Dewsbury Hall signed a new deal. Harvey Barnes went nowhere. Vardy signed a new deal. Maddison's gone nowhere yet and probably will sign a new deal. And even though Fofana left, he signed a new deal in March. So I think they felt the core was there. They've had a lot of bad luck defensively with injuries. Ricardo was one of the best fullbacks in the Premier League, but has never been the same since his injury. And it's out again. Castagne's had injury problems, but when fully fit, is a very good player as well. So I think Brendan Rodgers saw the core potential, even though he knew his squad was a bit thin, and wanted to try and keep that together. And now, unfortunately, they're in a position where they've lost Fofana. Tielemans is probably going to leave either in January or on a free in a year's time. There may be interest in Maddison, so they are going to have to find that money. And luckily for Leicester, some of that Fofana money, in fact, the vast majority of it, will be paid within a full calendar year. So by next summer, they should have a lot more freedom in the market. So those are the kind of main reasons. It's not mismanagement. It's the opposite. It's the ownership group. Even the fans don't like it, having to pull the strings. And unlike Mike Ashley, we're lucky as Leicester fans because we've seen exactly what this ownership group are all about. We know that if they could possibly spend, they will spend. Their level of ambition, their affinity with the club, their love for the club, their care for the club is not to be doubted. And that's been shown time and time again. So the fact they now can't spend, I think the fan base are relatively empathetic towards that. And then the final thing to note is just that Leicester's ownership group is King Power. King Power is a duty-free magnate, and they've always had a monopoly historically in Thailand. And the late owner had a good relationship with the King of Thailand. But now it's a bit more of a free market, and it has to be in the aftermath of COVID because airports themselves and those within the aviation and even government need to take money where they can. So King Power don't have the same level of monopoly or control anymore, either in Thailand or across Asia, where they've got other bases, and then people are either traveling less or have been anyway over the last few years, or they've been spending less. So naturally, in the same way that airlines are struggling, so is anything affiliated to that industry, which means that King Power themselves don't really have any fallback at the moment. So when your core ownership business is struggling, when your football club has spent a lot of money on its long-term future, when your wage bill is really, really high, it all adds up to when you have to then move within the financial rules of profit and sustainability and financial fair play. It means that Leicester don't have too much leeway to do what they want right now. And I think that unfortunately has led to a very poor start to the season, a lack of freshness, a lack of ideas, a lack of confidence. And it's about firefighting now for Leicester, because if they can stay up, which I think they will this season, then in a year's time, things should be a whole lot healthier.
Yeah. No, Ben, it's been great. I wish you all the best as a Leicester fan. You know, I hope Leicester have a good season, as I hope we do too. Two great clubs that deserve all the success that they can get. But yeah, I just want to thank you once again for coming on. It's been absolutely brilliant. Really loved having you on the show, my friend. Hope you've enjoyed it too.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep up the good work. Always happy to come on. Let's hope that Newcastle have a great season ahead and they excite and they get back to that sort of attacking, free-flowing football that we saw in the kind of Keegan days. And then I think that's the point. I've said it many times that if you offer Newcastle fans that 3-3 against Man City or that 2-1 loss against Liverpool, of course, that's only 1 point out of 6. But I think you take that all day over inconsistently grinding out a 1-0 win here and there and not feeling like there's a plan. Because if you keep playing like you did against Manchester City and Liverpool across a 38-game season, you will win more than you lose, which I think is why people will, I don't quite want to say enjoy, although as a neutral I would use that word, but I think that's why people relish and talk about and are excited about a 3-3 or even that 2-1 loss, because you come away with it thinking like, hang on a minute, even though we lost at Liverpool or even though we could have beaten Man City and we didn't, like I'm still kind of buzzing because you use that game to see the change, the movement, the improvement, the plan. And you know that come the next game, they're going to do that again and do that again. And Man City are one of the few teams that can come back and equalize and come back from 3-1 down. But a Liverpool wouldn't have come down from 3-1 down. A Chelsea wouldn't have come down from 3-1 down. And Arsenal, a Man U wouldn't have come from 3-1 down. It's probably only Man City and, dare I say, Leicester that would have been able to come back and get points from those games. So that, I think, is why it's going to be a really good season for Newcastle, because they're approaching every game like that with this never say die attitude, with this desire, home or away, to try and get on the front foot. They're organised. They've proven in certain games, particularly away from home, that they're not susceptible to conceding too many sloppy goals. So it all adds up for a really good season, and I certainly wish Newcastle well.
It does, yeah. Two things I always think, and I've said this before, for a successful football club on and off the pitch, you've got to have hope and ambition. Now, if you don't have either of those, you'll never have success. If you have one of those, you might have a little bit of success. But if you have both, if you've got hope and ambition, and that's at any level, you know, that's at like League 2 level, Championship, whatever. As long as you've got those two things, you can do great things with your football club. Sadly, for 14 years, we both lacked hope and ambition. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that we were never going to do well under Ashley if we didn't have those two vital things. And Leicester are a great example of a club that have had both of those things, hope and ambition, over the past, you know, at least the last decade or so. So yeah, I hope we can win a couple of trophies like you lads have in the next few years. And yeah, I was going to touch on VAR, but we're not. I think we're going to run out of time. What we'll do, we'll save that for another one, maybe in the future. Get you back on. I think we might have had a few more points this season if VAR had been fully operational in that sense. But yeah, Ben, listen, thank you very much, my friend. It's been brilliant. Just want to say thanks again for coming on, and thanks to all the listeners and subscribers out there tonight. We'll be back again on Saturday after the Bournemouth match, which is now going ahead. That was going to be a question for Ben. Did he think that the matches were going ahead? We've had that answered tonight already earlier on. So, yeah, so I'll see you Saturday evening, guys, for another full time whistle. Please like and subscribe and help the channel grow. We're trying to create something special here, getting guests on like Ben. It's been a great honor tonight. We've had Andy Sixsmith on, Steve Wraith. We're going to try and get the big hitters on for you guys. So, Ben, once again, thank you very much. And all the listeners and subscribers out there, I've been Ben from the Full Time Whistle, Mouth of the Tyne. This is Live with Ben Jacobs. All the best, guys. Cheers. See you later.